What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy and welcome to the channel. Today I have a special video for you because we are covering Flying Lotus on this episode of How to Byte, and Flying Lotus was actually the first kind of beat that I ever made way back in 2013 when I started with the machine. Here's what the beat sounds like. So if you guys like that sound, and we already have our disclaimer in place where you all know that I'm not Flying Lotus and you're not Flying Lotus, we can go ahead and talk about some of the ways that this beat was curated. The biggest thing that I took away from Flying Lotus is that, for one, he uses tons of layers and he has an immaculate sense of swing. And while everything that I made within this beat in particular was from scratch, a lot of times it's definitely okay to find interesting samples to use, or to, find something that already has its own predisposition rhythm that you find through pitching or slowing something down to where it seems kind of off, but you can use it as a basis to build your drum groove off of. So before we get started, thank you all so much. We are on the other side of 10,000 subscribers and I can finally sleep at night. What else do I want to say? And I just want to tell you all thank you so much. We have a giveaway going on. There's a short if you go on my page where we're giving a sub pack away. So we've got tons of stuff going on. We've got a lot to talk about. Let's go ahead and talk about how this beat was made. So I'm not really going to get into the sound design stuff with this too much, just because this would end up being an hour-long video. However, I will say that everything within this came from Phase Plant. The drums came from Phase Plant, the percussion came from Phase Plant, just about everything came from Phase Plant, and I've got tons of tutorials on how to do stuff like that. But what I do want to talk about is how you go from creating a simple kick drum pattern kind of like this to starting to build all of the percussive layers on top. Now, the key premise of this is whenever I started curating these kinds of beats, I kind of just put the snare on grid, and then I have this really cool trick to where if you hold Option and Command, you can actually grab the placement of the sample and move it off or on in time. And so you can see that everything here is just a little bit set forward, and that creates an extra sense of kind of delay to the entire tune. Now, you can't really tell because we start the entire tune off beat here in this way. But if you listen to this with the metronome in real time, you can hear that the metronome is actually hitting before the beat, and that's what gives this already kind of like a cool natural sense of swing. That's a really easy thing to do, and then of course you can actually get into like creating your kick and snare and just kind of playing around with like placing things on and off beat in the first place, which is kind of what I did right here. But the cool thing about this is that if your kick is on the 1 and your snare is on the 2, then this right here becomes kind of arbitrary. You can kind of place it just about anywhere you want because it's kind of fortified by things that are keeping the rest of the rhythm together intact. And that's kind of the key to creating some cool and interesting kick snare patterns. The other thing that I have is a layered clap on every other snare, or every other like second and fourth beat. And that just kind of helps create a little bit more interest within saying like, it's not just the same snare every time. It's a little bit different. And that way you kind of help have this like kind of swinging back and forth rhythm where it goes to boom, boom, clap, to boom, boom, big clap, right? So once you have something like that, then the next piece of this would be to resample the entire thing and to send it through any kind of effects. But you can see here that this layer is actually just the kick snare pattern. And it's really cool because listening to this, you can hear that pretty much what I did was I took the lows of this out and then I pitched it up just a little bit. But what this has allowed me to do is take the same drum loop and kind of play with the pitching and some of the effects, and then also change this into beats mode here. And that allowed me to kind of have another sense of percussion to go along with this. And so actually all of this other stuff here in the same sense is just resampling the same kick drum pattern that I used. And you can do that too. And if you're like wanting to know like a place to resample things or whatever, like just start with some distortion and then start messing around with beats modes and then change the repitch mode and stuff. I've got a masterclass coming out pretty soon based off of how to go like really in detail with resampling, but for the sake of wanting to talk about the other things, we're going to go ahead and move on to some of the other elements. The last thing that I will say about the percussion though is that every track has a track delay on it, or at least just about every track. And the reason why is because once you kind of get everything together and you have all the layers that you like, sometimes you can actually manipulate the swing of the groove or like get it to have a really noticeable push and pull if you start to use track delays by pushing things or everything else a little bit late. For example, if you have something like this that is on a 16th grid, kind of like this, and we listen to it like this. For this in particular, I actually did this manually, but you can see that even though every clip is on beat, every actual like waveform is pushed a little bit more over to the side, over to the side, over to the side. And again, you can do this by either adding a track delay, which would be a time shift, or you can do this by manually kind of like this, because this is actually all the same sample. I've just kind of moved or duplicated this one, moved it over and turned it down a little bit. To get that extra movement in the back, we use a frequency shifter and then also a little bit of a delay here. And whenever you send that through a parallel signal, kind of like this, and you use a Haas effect, then that will make it nice and wide, but it'll also give you a nice kind of like shaker, I guess, like vibe that makes it seem like the rhythm is more full. So the last layer within this that I also wanted to talk about was whenever you send stuff through a lot of reverb, then you can use that and drench it and then split this up into its own separate consistent rhythms. So this is on every fourth beat, but it's kind of like a 1/4 beat of a sidechain. And together with some of these elements, you can hear that like it creates a very dense sense of polyrhythm. And at first glance, it might seem like it's a little bit too busy, but whenever you throw a really heavy sidechain over this with the kick and snare, it kind of helps push everything out of the way. Works for me. I will say that my kick and snare are way too loud compared to a typical mix of a Flying Lotus tune, but I like to make my drums as loud as possible just because I like making loud drums. So, you know, again, this is a how to bite, not how to copy video, and that's just one of my own personal things. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and talk about some of the instrumentation, which is actually very simple. All of these are the same pad or the same kind of like chord that I've made. They're just different variations of it. So the bass one, or the first one that I made, sounds like this. And what I did was, before I even used the multi-note, I kind of just made a very simple sine wave with a pitch shifter to kind of give it a little bit more harmonics over the top. And then honestly, if you take a sine wave and you send it through a convolution reverb, it's always going to sound cool. It's really hard to go wrong with this as far as creating something interesting. As you can hear though, I took off a lot of the low end and high end, and that kind of allowed me to create like a nice, almost Rhodes type feel. and that kind of softens it up a little bit. Now with the chord, I kind of just grabbed a multi-note, and something that's pretty common within a lot of Flying Lotus music is that they will take the same kind of like chord structure of like the same distance between the notes. I'm not really sure how to notate that in the correct way, but they'll kind of play in key with that and make their own kind of riff. And sometimes I don't really know how to describe that in a musical terms, but everything is playing the same kind of chord with every note. It's just in a particular scale, and so that's why you get this really cool like off sounding rhythm, or off sounding kind of like chord progression. And what's cool about this too is that it's something that still has a very followable melody, but it doesn't necessarily like change the vibe too much. It still kind of seems like it's a little bit strange and mysterious and eerie. So the second layer that we have is actually a copy of the same thing. It's just a high layer of it. I've added a little bit of sync to this and a flanger on top, but other than that, it's pretty much the exact same. A little bit of dynamics pushing the top end up. And then this is just a low pad version of this. And I guess I used a different convolution reverb. Now these other two are actually carbon copies of these. It's just that I've actually added a little bit of vibrato to them in order to change up the main section. And that just kind of helps keep the rest of the beat a little bit more interesting. And while I would say that this isn't particularly like finished by any means, it's something that kind of helps keep everything a little bit more fresh whenever you kind of go through all that. So the last thing that I want to talk about is the bass, and there's two different basses with this. The first one is just a very simple sine wave bass with just a little bit of distortion and a filter. And the second one is a little bit more distortion. It's still a sine wave, but this has just a little bit more crunchiness to it, and I've actually added some dynamics to the top end, and I'm also playing kind of octaves within this riff. So it's the same riff, but I'm playing low, high, low, high. And this is, to me, very reminiscent of Parisian Goldfish. Now, one other thing I'll say with this is that if you add a little bit of delay to it, then it kind of helps give it the womp. You don't necessarily have to do that with a filter in order to get the movement or the feel or the vibe that you want. But moving everything off again with the time shift along with the drums help give everything a larger sense of rhythm to make it actually kind of fit within the tune. So yeah, the way that this beat came together is actually relatively simple. You kind of just want to think about, instead of going and fishing and trying to make a beat with like your sample library and stuff, like start with a couple of samples that you really like, and then just resample your loop a few times and send it through some effects, and then you can start to build percussion off of that. And then once you have that, you really just need to do a vibe check, and so you can either go find a sample or you can make some very easy chords, and then from there, with whatever chord progression you have, just start to create a bass line out of the same notes, because all of these notes are exactly the same. They're just a very simple and slightly different sounds. So I hope that was informative to you all. I know that I didn't cover everything to exact extent detail, but again, there's a lot of stuff to cover when you're talking about an entire beat. And if you guys have any questions about something that I may have missed, then feel free to leave that in the comment section. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate everything, and I will see you in the next How to Bite.